What's up, everybody? Peter X is so Coffer here, and welcome to another episode, actually the second episode of Team Building in the 21st Century. So, yeah, I'm trying to build this idea out, and it's rooted in because when I mentor folks, younger folks, I always tell them to get a side hustle and to uh, because they're going to need it at some point, and get skills that they can do on the side, and so I'm experimenting with this channel and trying to figure out ways other than just giving that advice and trying to give more. And in the first episode I talked about having a team kind of form sort of organically and sort of by accident that deals with professional issues and things, you know, getting, interns and jobs and dealing with different situations in the workplace. And so I kind of had a team of like that form with some of my um, former interns. So I'm trying to figure out how to kind of um, do some sort of framework or structure a method to so more can use that. But I think that's in this in this type of economy that is going to be needed. And so also in the first episode I said I would look at some bands and groups and then look at sports and specifically coaches. Well, I tried to do a couple coaches. I tried looking at Pat Riley and uh, Bill Belichick and look, watch some of their interviews, and it just didn't work. They weren't telling me much, so I'm gonna have to stick with my musicians, unfortunately. So today I'm doing the Beatles, and brief history: John Lennon is the founder of the Beatles. They were originally called the Quarrymen. Um, and before they were signed or did any records, they did a couple of stints in Hamburg, Germany. From Liverpool, England to Hamburg, Germany, and that's where they got to open up. And the first time they met Little Richard, and that was a turning point. Little Richard, particularly with Paul McCartney, he had a big influence on Paul McCartney. Ringo was not in the band yet. The first excursion to Hamburg, Pete Best was the drummer, and Pete Best they also used. I don't know if it was the basement of a shop or whatever, but the Best family they're the ones that had the rehearsal space. But eventually, they had to let Pete Best go before that second Hamburg stint, which was a lot shorter than the first one. Varying reasons as to why. I think officially the Beatles have always said, he wasn't a great Beatle, meaning he didn't socialize with other members. But some people say he just didn't, he just was not good enough as a drummer. Pete Best denies that vigorously. Who knows? But two things out there on that. So after the first trip to Hamburg, Ringo's brought into the band, and Brian Epstein, someone's like, you have to hear the Beatles, you have to hear these guys, and they were playing the Cavern Club at the time, and the Beatles were the hottest band in Liverpool, and so he went to the Cavern Club on lunch, and then he saw them, and he knew these guys had something. Now Epstein was in the closet gay at the time, which was pretty a problem back in the mid '60s. In England, his family was probably upper middle class, maybe wealthy. I mean, his father was a business owner, had a furniture store, and they started selling more, brought in musical instruments and then records, and then so Brian ends up, uh, running the record store aspect of what what we would call a department store, and it ended up being the biggest record store in Liverpool. So that's, and then he got connections that way. And so that's kind of why, when he discovered the Beatles, he didn't have any managerial experience, but he still had some connections because of the record store. So Brian Epstein takes on the Beatles. The thing he does is in Hamburg, they were, wearing leather and they had a wild show and a good show, but he really got them disciplined on stage. They weren't as disciplined as he would like on stage, and he also got them a uniform look and early branding that look. And of course, when they came to the U.S., everyone was like, "Oh my God, the long hair." Well, it was branding. I mean, Brian Epstein knew what he was doing with that. And so, Beatles fans always argue, who's the fifth Beatle? Well, I argue there's a fifth and a sixth Beatle. And I'll say Brian Epstein's the fifth Beatle because he came, first, and then the sixth Beatle would be George Martin, because George Martin knew the studio backwards and forwards and knew his music theory and helped the Beatles immensely early on with their songwriting. Whereas, the Rolling Stones and Mick and Keith had to figure it out on their own, they had a mentor and a teacher in George Martin. So they were able to kind of, run ahead of the Stones because of that. The other thing Brian Epstein was really good at was getting free publicity. So, George Martin goes back to the early 1950s, I think. So he was already in the business for 10 years and knew his way around the studio very well. And I mean, the record, so he was not, he wasn't there, in the late 40s when the record business kind of was born, but he was there, pretty early on in that whole process. Now, when folks have that discussion on who the fifth Beatle is, sometimes Billy Preston comes up, American black, great keyboardist, had some, big songs of his own in the 70s as a solo artist. But he came in late after Sgt. Pepper when, the temperatures were rising and the band members weren't getting along, and many credit Billy Preston for settling the band down so they could get their last two albums done, and he probably did. All four band members liked him. So hey, if there's a seventh Beatle member, hey, we'll go with Billy Preston. I'm doing it sequentially so no one can get too upset with me. But the downfall with the Beatles kind of started, with Brian Epstein's passing. The Beatles had a lot of respect for him. They referred to him as Mr. Epstein. So Paul wanted his father-in-law to take Brian Epstein's place as manager, and John Lennon wanted the just fired manager for the Rolling Stones to take over the managerial thing, and it never was settled. It's one people always think that if Brian Epstein doesn't have his drug overdose, the Beatles, we may have gotten some more of the Beatles, and it very well could be the case. Paul was not. The Rolling Stones manager wasn't horrible, but he was fired for a reason. Yeah, so the Rolling Stones manager was Andrew Oldham, and look, the Beatles the Rolling Stones were flat broke at the end of the 60s and had to go to the south of France and record Exile on the Main Street to pay off their tax bill and to get in the black. So I don't think, Paul McCartney knew that. Yes, there's the Beatles-Stones rivalry, but it's a complicated relationship. They're friends. The Beatles gave the Stones a song, early on in their career. So there is a song, I don't remember what it's called, that both the Beatles and the Stones did. It was written by the Beatles. But they would coordinate, so their album releases, so they weren't clashing with each other. So yeah. So we kind of have gotten into the role of the support, the role that Billy Preston played and uh, um, Brian Epstein played and George Martin played. What about the Beatles? Well, Ringo, the joke was always, Ringo wasn't even the best drummer in the band. Paul was. And, Paul probably very well might be a better drummer than Ringo. I mean, Paul is probably the best musician alive on the planet. He played bass for the Beatles, so he's a very good piano player, and he's a very good guitarist as well. But Ringo was a better, the drummer that the Beatles needed. And I mean, he was a basic drummer and he was great at it. I mean, Ringo knew how to get out of the way so Paul and John and George could do their magic. And simple job as the drummer for any band, but the Beatles is, keep time and make sure, you don't mess up, everything is on rhythm, and he was very good at that. It's interesting, he left the band for a couple of weeks during the White Album, and Paul jumped on the drums, and John Lennon jumped on the drums, and they were like, yeah, this isn't working, let's call Ringo, and Ringo came back. So Ringo was the perfect drummer for the Beatles. Ringo also got along with everybody probably the best, and when the Beatles broke up, I mean, Ringo worked with all the other three members, all of them in the studio. They all worked on Ringo's album, and Ringo worked on all their stuff. That can't be said for some of the other members. I'm not sure. I know Paul and John never worked together, and I don't think Paul and George worked together because we know how complicated Paul and John's relationship was, but Paul and George's was just as complicated. So, and I don't know about John or George, but I doubt if again, going back to Paul and George, I don't think they worked together. So Ringo really was the backbone of the band. If you watch the Get Back, the long documentary on Disney Plus. I mean, Ringo, is there waiting on the band, and Mr. Reliable. So George, he had, I've said this in other episodes on the Beatles, he always brought the mood, and even though Paul was the taskmaster and whatnot, he still found a way, and he was great with guitar tone. He added a spiritual dimension. He was always, India meditation and stuff like that. John Lennon, he was I mean, heavily influenced. He's one of the great lyricists of all time. He was the optimist. He was the dreamer. That comes across. I mean, his Imagine it. That's his masterpiece, and all that comes out. But he was that. He could also be very cantankerous and hard to get along with as well. And then finally, Paul McCartney. He became the leader at the end. He had a strong work ethic. I call him the king of hooks, but the guy can just write hooks all day. And again, I mentioned a couple minutes ago about how he's a very extremely adept, very good musician as well. So yeah, that's that it was complicated. George was the youngest, and Paul and George went to school together, the equivalent of what would be high school here in the U.S. And so, being that George was the youngest, he and Paul had a interesting, Paul and George, there was friction there, and Ringo was the oldest, and that's probably why he got along with everybody. And then Paul and John started off well, but it got complicated as the years went by, and thankfully, the Get Back documentary, shows that it wasn't Yoko Ono that was the theme for many years, and some John admirers, and there's still a lot of folks who the Beatles should have never broke up, and they blamed Yoko for many years, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, there John was a grown man, and the problems were, that got worse when Yoko entered the picture, probably. But hey, John was who he was, and it was going to happen anyway. So why did the Beatles break up? Well, they grew apart, obviously. Um, they were probably creatively spent. That's a lot of music to put out in a very short time, and we're talking 5 years, and they did. But I'm just going to talk the albums and not the 12 to 13, and I'm not counting the soundtracks were a different thing. I don't know what to make of the soundtracks, but they had a different approach. I'm not sure what the approach to the soundtracks were, but it was a different animal there. And then Brian Epstein's death, I covered that. The other thing, number 4 is Paul wanted a tour, and the other members did not want a tour, and particularly George. I mean, George hated the screaming. You know, the Beatles, I mean, they couldn't even hear themselves playing. It was so loud at times. And this was, they were playing Shea Stadium. They were playing very loud events. And in retrospect, they were, they did not play with the best equipment. I mean, their amplifiers were probably for, 5 to 10, 15,000, 5 to 10,000 people rather than, baseball stadiums. And so, you live and you learn. And, when, the Stones were the first to do the stadium tours like that, the big stadium tours, and they adjusted and learned how to, and obviously by Woodstock, they had learned how to, do proper amplification for big venues. The other thing too is, hey, I mean, the Beatles aren't stupid. They were in London, and they knew Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath were coming. I mean, that was bubbling up, and Paul did Helter Skelter to try to capture some of that and compete with it. But that really wasn't who the Beatles were, and so. It would have been very interesting if the Beatles did go in the early '70s and would they even be considered a rock band? They are because they bowed out and retired at the right time. I mean, it's interesting. John Lennon used the term pop and rock interchangeably when it came to the Beatles' music. But they're still considered a rock band, and if they hang around a few more years, they're probably a pop band. I mean, Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend call them a pop band. They don't, but it is, it is what it is. The other thing too is, I think that the sixth thing about, the fall of the Beatles and why. I mean, when they retired, the rise of the synthesizer happens, and particularly the Mini Moog, and they were available, but they were huge, and they weren't portable and whatnot, and by the early '70s, the synthesizers were becoming a lot more portable, and a lot of the stuff that the Beatles did, and George Martin did, and his Magic, and then all that stuff. To make these, wild sounds and just creative. I mean, you can do that same stuff with a synthesizer. So the synthesizer leveled the playing field for, the Beatles' rivals when it came to creating interesting sounds in their music. I mean, when you talk about the Beatles, it's also, to understand their roles in the band. And the team, I mean, you have to look at them post the Beatles. And then, as I said, Paul had a great solo career, could write great hooks. And, John Lennon, again, great solo career, but you could tell he was the lyricist. He really was good at lyrics. He went back to his roots, the roots of rockabilly. So he comes, he was more out of the rockabilly roots and than the blues, and that definitely shows. And really, Paul comes out of the pop roots in some ways. John didn't tour a lot. I know he did a big, in the mid 70s, he did a big concert at the Madison Square Garden, but he didn't do a lot of touring. Um, George, came out and surprised a lot of people in the early 70s with his solo work. But George did not tour much. He did a tour in 74 and then one in, I believe, 77 or 78. And did not tour again until, his time with the Traveling Wilburys from 1988 to 1996. And then George also got into movies in the late 80s as well. But George's big thing was the concert for Bangladesh in the early 70s. Uh, as I said, you know, Ringo probably had, you know, socialized and worked with all the members the most, post Beatles. So let's look at the Beatles. Why did the team work? Well, Ringo's is an underrated, but he was you could tell just by watching Get Back when the tensions were in the band, he was the peacemaker, even though, you could tell just, and then, his relationships with the other three members, after the Beatles broke up. You know, Brian Epstein really cared about the Beatles. I mean, Brian Epstein and George Martin were uh, the mentors for the Beatles, and they really were, very, very important. Everybody needs, mentors, and the the hero's journey. So when you look at Brian Epstein, I mean, he really cared about the Beatles. Um, he was the first really good manager in some ways. I mean, Colonel Tom robbed Elvis blind. Jackie Wilson had a terrible manager who was, part of the mob, and um, uh, you know, but Brian Epstein in general was a very, very good, manager. The one, mistake he made is, selling off the song rights and the the ownership of the masters of Northern Lights. But most of the folks didn't know that at the time, how important it were. I'm pretty sure Elvis didn't. I'm pretty sure Colonel Tom owned Elvis's masters, and I talked about this as well. The Rolling Stones don't own the masters of most of their work from the '60s. So, I mean, no, he didn't know. But I think he was he did the best he could with what he knew. And again, I mean, remember he ran a record store, and so the Beatles, that was his first and only gig as a manager. Um, so comparing him now, James Brown, was the first to own his masters. He got his masters in the mid 60s, and the interesting thing with James, I mean, by the time Alan Leeds arrives in Cincinnati to work for James Brown, I think it's 69 or 70, uh, James was essentially managing himself. He did not have a manager. I mean, he did his own managing, was very hands-on, and he had a staff that did the tasks that a manager would do. But James was his own manager, and that says a lot. Um, so yeah, I mean, so the team. I mean, Brian Epstein was critical to the team and to the Beatles' success. So then the sixth Beatle, George Martin. Now, interestingly enough, he wasn't overly impressed when he first met the Beatles, but he gave him a chance. And, again, as I said earlier, he taught them the art of songwriting. He showed them around the studio, and he was a master of the studio at the time. And he could be hard on the Beatles. I mean, uh, Love Me Do, one of their first singles in 1962, for whatever reason, Ringo couldn't get it, so he used a session drummer on Ringo. So he was also kind of a taskmaster. But as the tensions in the band rose, he kind of he's still around, but he receded to the background. I mean, the White Album, he was there, but it wasn't a good scene sometimes, and he was there, but he was, trying to stay out of the way. And then, of course, what I call the seventh Beatle, Billy Preston. I mean, who knows if Abbey Road and Let It Be happened, without Billy Preston being in his presence and, you know, reinvigorating the band. So what's the takeaway, of the Beatles, if you're trying to build a team, and to go back to the first episode, the team that, um, a tribe with a purpose, or your chosen family, and, the experiment, recognize folks' strengths and weaknesses, and then try to, enhance, bring out people, strengths, and share your strengths with others in the, in the group, and, to make others stronger, and maybe, suggest ways to, you know, take someone's weaknesses and turn them into a strength. And, there's also situations where, you don't have to change, and the weakness does become a strength depending on again, the situation. So, yeah, going to continue on with this, and I'm going to try to focus it again on, using this as this basically kind of a cooperative economic collective thing that I formed with my interns, and that's kind of the direction, when I talk. But there's different things you can do with this. And again, going back to the first episode, I mean, if you're a small business owner, there's a lot of things you can learn, from the Beatles too, as far as just or trying to build your small business. I mean, you're going to need a mentor, so find a good mentor. Does that mentor become part of the team? Not necessarily, but it is, you know, building the team. The team members don't have to all meet. They don't even have to interact with each other. I mean, you can have, sub teams, or going back, to the Indiana House of Representatives, we have committees, and like, the Ways and Means has subcommittees. So, you build that team and do what's necessary, and structured in the way that's necessary if you're trying to build a small business. So yeah, I mean, the George Martin and the Brian Epstein can help with that, and there's also one, we'll get in this as we go along too. I mean, there's when it comes to government contracting, I mean, there's primes, and then there's subprimes, and in some ways, if you're a emerging business owner, or trying to build your small business, you might want to partner up with a more experienced business person, and get a piece of the contract and be a subprime rather than the prime. I mean, that experienced business will get the whole contract, but, in Indiana, everybody has to, at least bring in some subprime. So, trying to spread that money out, and get, more businesses involved, and putting more food on the table, so to speak. So there's lessons, here when it comes to the Beatles, and team building, and the economics I'm trying to get to with this. So yeah, this came together a little better than I thought. To give it another listen tomorrow, but I think this works. But it's gotta remember, this closing now. I'm changing up a little, so I need you to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, as that helps me move up the YouTube algorithm. So, got 5 albums of my own right here on the YouTube channel, and I'm on all the streaming services as well. My music is under the name Exodus, Xodus, and I also have 2 science fiction fantasy novels and a novella on Amazon under the name Peter Exodus O'Coffer. So thank you again for coming through, and I will see you next episode.